Afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Richard, for the warm welcome, and thank you all as well, especially the organising committee for putting on such a great event. It's been a real educational, engaging session so far. So as Richard said, we work so hard in trying to optimise performance of our athletes. We spend many years trying to get them to the start line of pinnacle events, but it often might come down to that very, very last day or so where we fully realise the athletic potential of athletes. So today's talk, as Richard said, is going to be around, what are the strategies which we can implement to ensure that we do maximise, optimise the athletic potential of our athletes on competition day. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the what, why, when, and who. And this is based on kind of my experiences of working with some athletes, as well as some of the research that we do at Springs over in New Zealand. So when we use that word priming is kind of one of these words that's just kind of slipped its way into our kind of sports science vocabulary. And the words, warm-ups have been around a long time. We use the word potentiation, priming. These are all kind of explaining kind of the same phenomenon. It's about getting athletes ready to perform, a state of readiness. And if we go back to the literature, mid-1950s is when we first started to look at the effects of warm-up on athletic performance. And there's some quite nice, simple studies done in the 50s showing that warm-ups enhanced athletic performance. And then we kind of moved away from athletic performance and started to look a little bit more about the mechanistic aspects of why might a warm-up enhance your performance? What is it physiologically? What's it physiologically doing? And research kind of came up with these. The heart, we need a pulse raiser, we need to warm the muscles, we need to incorporate stretching, mobility, dynamic movements to prepare our bodies optimally. And I guess since the 2000s, we've kind of advanced on from there now. Now we kind of use these words of, optimization, individualization, and what priming strategies beyond just raising your core temperature a little bit or your muscle temperature, and beyond just looking at your range of motion. What other strategies can we put into practice to enhance our performance? This is a meta-analysis from 8 or so years ago, showing quite nicely the effects of just a simple warm-up. So even just a simple warm-up without any of the bells and whistles we see or use today in some of the priming strategies which are available, showing that a range of performance markers, whether that be explosive power, jumps, throws, etc., can be enhanced, not by very large amounts, but certainly the general trend is that warm-up does improve performance. And in about 79–80% of those studies had a performance-enhancing effect. And the ones that didn't enhance performance, those were the ones which probably lacked a little bit of specificity for the event that the athletes were going to do. So clearly, warm-up should be, or priming should be high in our thinking, getting athletes to the start line. But at the same time, I think we need to think broadly about what a priming strategy might look like. Okay, and this multi-system approach to priming, and not get too focused solely on muscle factors or other factors. So when I talk about looking at, and we've heard from the keynotes this week about putting the brain first. Okay, what role is the brain playing in priming ourselves ready for athletic performance? We talk about sleep priming. We talk about other factors in terms of priming. So looking holistically at what you could do to your athlete to get them in the right physical, mental state ready for that ultimate competition. We often see athletes wearing these. We don't know what really they're listening to. It might be nothing. It might just be trying to cancel out external noise or distraction. Okay, but it's become quite a commonplace now watching team sport athletes, individual athletes, looking at their own preparation ready for a sporting event. And this is what I mean by looking at beyond just the physical side of warm-up. And when we look at some of the data on how something like music, for example, impacts one of the key hormones which we sometimes want to augment in physical performance, and that's testosterone. What happens here in male athletes, it's quite different to what we see in, male individuals. These aren't athletes, by the way. This is non-athlete data, but I just want to kind of show the point that different types of music can have an impact on an individual's testosterone level. And it's different between genders. Okay, so if an athlete, if you're trying your hardest to put in physical strategies to augment a hormonal response, and then you choose the wrong type of music potentially, then are you undoing some of that kind of priming optimization? So thinking broadly about all those strategies that athletes do, are they counteracting each other, or are they kind of contributing to each other for enhancement? And I couldn't resist putting this up. For those of us Kiwis, there's probably two of us in the room. Then, you know, we know that athletes have lots of different ways of getting ready for competition. And the haka is a well-known Maori challenge or performance, which is used on lots of different occasions, but the All Blacks have kind of used it for many years now, right in that final stage before they're about to start a game. And there's a question mark there whether that is a priming. I'm sure it does get them pumped up, ready for competition for when that whistle blows. So just one kind of left field kind of thinking about how we get athletes ready for competitive performance. So I've talked about music, I've talked about the haka. What other tools are in the kind of priming toolbox? And these aren't all of them, by no means. But when we look at priming strategies, whether that's priming using just exercise, lifting techniques, whether it's using weighted garments to provide an added stress prior to exercise, respiratory muscle trainers, these are all kind of tools which are there at your disposal. And some of them might not be relevant to your sport or your event. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the factors before you jump into your toolbox. What are some of the factors that I think you should be thinking about? Well, the first one is, you know, your event demands and the intensity of the event that you're trying to help or support, because that would impact on whether you chose a respiratory muscle type priming tool versus a lifting technique versus something else. Events, every event has its own rules and regulations, the amount of time it might hold an athlete in the holding room prior to the start of a race. You need to really understand the kind of those windows of opportunity at which you're going to get your athlete to do the priming strategy. Okay, so knowing what it's like to have a 20-minute gap in the holding room, does the effect of your priming strategy wash out in that 20 minutes, or you know, what other strategies can you use so that when the athlete does get out on the start line, that they're actually have still kept hold of some of that priming potential. Environmental conditions. I'll talk a little bit later about heating and how muscle temperature might impact on physical performance. So whether the temperature's cool, cold, hot, might impact on how you choose certain strategies. There's probably a kind of a balance between being too hot and warm enough. What facilities and equipment you have, obviously a key part of the practicalities of some of these priming strategies. And the last two are kind of probably the most important two, and that is looking at your athlete's strengths and weaknesses, and what priming strategy might address some of those weaknesses or augment some of their strengths, as well as looking at the preferences of the athlete as well. They've got to buy into the priming strategy and believe that this priming strategy is going to work. And that comes through education, it comes through practice, it comes through rehearsal. So that you can't just pull one out of your toolbox and expect them to adopt it and use it. So lots of things to think about. So what are some of the research tell us about priming strategies? I'm going to start with the metabolic aspects, because I guess that's my kind of strength in terms of my kind of research area. But I'm going to kind of cover some different priming strategies that will be relevant to a whole range of different sports. And the momentum really started, you know, quite a few years ago, but really it wasn't until the 2000s where we really started to look at the effects of different types of warm-up. We knew that warm-up had an impact on performance, a positive impact, but what were the strategies? What was the intensity? What was the recovery between the warm-up and the event that optimized physical performance? And Dave Bishop started the work here by doing one of the kind of, I guess, the first comparative studies looking at kayak performance. And he compared 3 different warm-ups, and he got them to warm up for 15 minutes at 3 different intensities, and looked at 2-minute kayak performance. And I guess the message from that study was a harder than expected warm-up is a good thing. So the moderate and heavy warm-up enhanced performance, and the very heavy warm-up inhibited performance. So this was moving away from that this low to moderate warm-up that most athletes were doing at the time. You know, we can actually push them a little bit harder and induce a little bit of metabolic stress prior to the performance trial. And I think for me, the study by Bailey in 2009 kind of started to kind of even advance that even further and started to look at, well, we can push our athletes hard, but what's the duration between the warm-up and the actual performance event? And these authors showed quite nicely that when you administer a heavy warm-up, 3 minutes is too short, and certainly more than 9 minutes. This is the time to exhaustion here. So you want the bars to be higher rather than lower. And you can see here this 3-minute recovery period between the warm-up or the primer and the time to exhaustion resulted in a lower performance. But you can see that a 9-minute and a 20-minute after a heavy warm-up enhanced performance compared to the control and a less intense warm-up. So it told us two things: that a heavy warm-up was a good thing, but you needed to make sure that it wasn't too close to competition. Certainly more than 9 minutes and even up to 20 minutes were getting the biggest response. But that was in untrained athletes, in trained individuals, and I guess the following study, which came out at a very similar time, these are from the same research group, so they were probably kind of doing these studies in tandem. And this was very good caliber cyclists, and they looked at a range of intensities to try and tease out, well, what intensities might benefit from a priming strategy. And this is the critical power or power duration curve. And we can see that the warm-up, which is the priming, which is the red, shifted the power duration relationship. So for any given duration, power was augmented, okay, was increased. So telling us that warm-up is beneficial, a heavy warm-up is beneficial for a range of intensities above critical power, right up to our kind of maximum levels up here. Okay. Now we were interested in this. A lot of these studies had just done bouts of constant intensity. So they'd got athletes like Bishop did for 15 minutes constant load, 6 minutes constant load in the case of Bailey and Burnley studies. And we were interested, well, what happens if we give them some intermittent exercise? What happens if we kind of break that up a little bit and look at shortening the window? So we did a study looking at the effects of an intermittent priming strategy. So we got cyclists to exercise doing 4 different warm-ups, all at varying intensities, starting at 100% of their peak aerobic power, 150 and an all-out. So we were really trying to stimulate and get a feel for what was happening physiologically when they did these different warm-ups. And this is the protocol that we did. So you can see here the five sprints at the different intensities, and then they had a 5-minute rest, and then they did this 3K time trial performance. And what did we see? Well, this bottom one here is the hardest warm-up. So clearly, and this is the mean power. So high is good, low is bad. So an all-out intermittent priming strategy is not a smart idea. Not when you've only got 5 minutes recovery. Okay, so that's an indication that we can actually overcook the athletes. But if you look at the other intensities, all fairly similar. Okay, this is the splits over each 500-meter segment. And what was interesting thing about this study is that we actually gave a self-selected. So we asked the athletes to pick their own warm-up. So we found that the self-selected warm-up was no worse or no better than the individually prescribed warm-up. So athletes tend to, I guess, are tuned in with their bodies. They know kind of where they're at and maybe what they need to prime. So whilst we can kind of enforce optimal priming strategies on them, then in this study using high-intensity intermittent priming, it didn't come out any greater than actually just letting the athletes do what they wanted to do. And what did they want to do? In this study, they were probably a little bit biased by our protocol here because they exercised for about the same duration. And probably in terms of the intensity, it was probably a little bit lower than the middle intensity trial. Okay, so they are still working at a fairly decent intensity. Other studies have been done in track runners, looking at the modifying warm-ups, and again, this getting across this message that a harder warm-up is beneficial. So Steve Ingham's was working at the English Institute of Sport when they published this work back in 2012. And they looked at getting athletes to do a race pace 200 metres 20 minutes before an 800 metre time trial. Okay, and looked at the effects of the performance. And they chose the 20 minutes because 20 minutes in athletics typically is the holding time room. So they were looking at to optimize their athletes' performance on the track, taking into account. And they showed quite nicely that increasing the intensity of the warm-up and making it more intense for longer had a performance-enhancing effect. But again, this was with a 20-minute recovery. I don't think they would have seen the same findings with a shorter recovery. So 1.2 second improvement over 800 meters. That's meaningful in terms of the standard of running that they had. So that's kind of the metabolic priming kind of area. We know we can work athletes fairly hard during warm-up. It needs to be more than about 9 minutes plus, and the intermittent intensity is another way to do that. And we can get a good performance enhancement. But what about the kind of shorter duration sports, which might necessarily lend itself to a metabolic priming, something which might be more recruitment and muscular? And this word PAP, post-activation potentiation, has been around for kind of quite a while now, and it's a lot of athletes use this. And the concept is behind this is that athletes can pre-prime their muscle by doing a fairly heavy lifting load, for example. And then there's a window in which fatigue is dissipated, but the priming effect is kind of hung around. It's still in existence. And this is this so-called window of opportunity where there is an enhanced performance potential in the muscle. And this is in here. So fatigue is decreased after the initial, and this might be some lifting, for example, some squats. A percentage of your 1RM, you activate the musculature, the neuromuscular system. You induce a little bit of fatigue, but that fatigue washes out within kind of 8-ish minutes. But the potentiation lasts quite a while, so there's a window here where we can actually utilize that potentiation. There's been a really nice review by Seats and Half, who've looked at different sports, different events to look at, well, how does this potentiation wash out in terms of different events? And they're focused really on power events. And you can see here the effect size is a fairly small 0.25, 0.3. So we're not talking huge effects, but certainly enough to cause an improvement in physical explosive power and speed performance. But there is, as you can see, quite a bit of individual variability in between the studies. So some of the factors that might determine whether you're going to respond to PAP as a sprint power-based athlete, then your strength level. Okay, if you're a stronger athlete, you tend to respond to PAP more so than whether you're a kind of weaker athlete or a less strength-based athlete, and that could have something to do with the fiber types that you have as a stronger athlete, potentially bigger muscles, more type 2 fibers potentially. So that's one thing to consider in your looking at your PAP approach. Also, whether you're novice, or your training status, whether you're a kind of a beginner, experienced, or kind of moderately trained, has an impact. The labels haven't populated here, but this is more experienced and this is less experienced. So more experienced athletes can stand to gain more from a post-activation potentiation approach. But also the different loading characteristics, so such as the time between the potentiation and the performance trial is supporting that kind of window of about 8 to 12 minutes. The number of sets, multiple sets versus one set has been shown to be more effective, and the intensity as well. So there are lots of athlete characteristics and a lot of loading characteristics which you need to consider in trying to optimize your potentiation approach. Another thing which has kind of come on the radar recently is if you don't have time to potentiate your athletes in that kind of 8 to 10 minute window prior to an event, maybe when they're in the holding room, then you can actually get some gains by doing some work earlier that day, or certainly that 5 to 6 hour period before. And Christine Cook and Liam Kilding have done quite a lot of nice work in this kind of priming, AM priming for PM performance. And they're particularly interested in the hormonal aspect to as an augmenter of enhanced performance in some of these explosive power events. And they've shown that when you look at an AM priming approach, well, in this study what they did is they looked at different types. This is the control condition. They did some running sprints, some lifting or some explosive cycling, and they looked at the change in testosterone between the AM PM when they'd done each of these different priming modes on different days. And you can see here that the weight training, and this is the, so we're really comparing this control value here with this value, and this value. And you can see here we do have an increase in testosterone, or a maintenance in our testosterone, because testosterone is, it's on a circadian rhythm, it's fluctuating throughout the day. Then some AM exercise can actually boost up your afternoon testosterone. But it seemed only to kind of show its face with running and lifting, not so much with the cycling exercise. In terms of some other research to support this, I've just got back from the Sports Science New Zealand conference, and there was some nice data there confirming that AM priming mitigated that circadian rhythm of testosterone. So it's certainly doing something to our hormonal fluctuations when we do prime with exercise in the morning, and that could be beneficial to afternoon performances. And interestingly, they showed quite a nice effect, or a bigger effect, in the female athletes compared with male athletes. So for those of you who have female groups, then looking at that AM priming could be of interest. But it all comes down to performance, and ultimately that's what we're all interested in. But this paper by Russell, they showed quite nicely that those effects were mirrored for the running and the lifting techniques, but it didn't kind of last for the whole of their performance trial. What they did is they did a multiple sprint protocol, and you can see here, so again, lower values are better on this sprint time, and these two modes of exercise, the priming, the AM priming running and the AM priming using resistance training or lifting, decreased the first two sprint times in their sprint test. So if you think of an athlete in an explosive sport where they need to express explosive power very quickly, then these two AM priming strategies did that better than a cycling priming strategy and the control. Okay, so certainly some evidence to suggest that we're shifting hormonal levels, and it's translating into a performance gain with the cycling, with the running and the lifting. Something's going on with my slides today. This was the kind of a bit of a kind of half-time talk in terms of, team sports in particular. They get to half-time, they go into the coaches, to the locker room, the dressers, and they have a team talk at half-time. They might sit there, and during that time, muscle temperature starts to drop and they start to kind of cool down. There's some quite good research evidence now to suggest that a re-warm-up prior to going back on the field is a good thing. And you can do that in a number of ways, and a number of studies have shown that you can either do a re-warm-up in the minutes prior to them going back on the pitch, and they've shown that the sprint performance when they restart the second half of the team sport is enhanced when you do a physical warm-up. Or if you don't have that kind of ability, you can do some passive heat warming in terms of keeping the limbs warm between those two halves in a game of football. So there's quite a bit of research looking at the half-time re-warm-up, but I'm not going to focus too much on that today. So PEP is, being very, pigeonholed into explosive power, sports, sprints, throws, jumps. But there's been a nice review by Bill Bosa in this year, starting to question what role does it play in endurance sports. And they've kind of argued, well, there's potentially an effect. PAP originally was thought to just kind of, I guess, manifest itself in people with type 2 fibres, but the research is starting to suggest that type 1 fibres can have an upregulation in terms of their potentiation as well, and what role does that play in endurance performance. But it does get a little bit more difficult with endurance performance, because once you start prolonged exercise, you've got a myriad of things changing. Muscle temperature, core temperature, you've got EMG changes, etc. So to really pinpoint the effect of PAP in endurance, it becomes a bit more tricky. But certainly mechanistically, there's a little bit of evidence to suggest that it does have a role to play. We've done some work kind of which I guess is not prolonged endurance, but certainly in endurance athletes, we've used a priming or a PAP type technique. Not heavy PAP lifting, not a squat-based thing, but more of a functional approach, and that's using weighted vests to, I guess, provide an added stress to the lower limbs prior to an endurance-type performance. And we were really interested in looking at this as a way to enhance running economy and a way to enhance muscle stiffness, increase stiffness, and running economy having a very close relationship. So we did a study where we took a group of endurance-trained athletes. We kind of warmed them up just quite generally. Then we measured their running economy. And then we got them to do 6 by 10 second strides, which is kind of what a lot of kind of track and field runners do. They kind of do some 3/4 pace strides with usually a walk-back recovery, just to get them used to that kind of race pace type exercise prior to their event. We did that with and without the wearing a weighted vest. And the weighted vest was about 15% of the athlete's body mass. So for these kind of fairly lean runners who are around about 65 to 70 kg, you get a feel for the kind of kilogram weightage that they were wearing around their torso in around that kind of 10 kilograms or so. Then we did recovery. Period 10 minutes, based on our knowledge that at least 9 minutes is needed to kind of optimize the performance. Then we did some jump tests because we wanted to measure stiffness. Then we wanted to measure re-measure our economy, and then we put them through an incremental test to exhaustion. So we got them to run as our performance indicator. So PAP for endurance via an incremental test. And this is what we found. Some quite nice findings across the board of our athletes, both in terms of performance. This is the peak speed that they reached in the treadmill test. This was their increase in stiffness between control and the weighted vest. And this was the reduction in economy. Again, and the relationship between the improvement in stiffness and economy was very high. So through using a weighted vest during a priming strategy, we've improved economy, we've made the athletes' lower limbs stiffer, and we've had an enhancement in performance. Okay. So that is a really positive kind of priming approach. And at the moment, we're just looking at, we use 15% body mass. We're just starting to play around now with, well, what happens if we use a little bit less, a little bit more? Can we start to kind of refine that optimal priming approach? We're not just recently this paper came out this last couple of weeks, again looking at team sport athletes, so similar thing to what we did. They've used PAP, they've measured stiffness in the Achilles, and they've seen changes in Achilles tendon stiffness and thickness in fairly well-trained basketball athletes. So, if you're looking to impact on muscle stiffness, globally, like we did in our study, this focused, used ultrasound and other methods to target what's happening in the Achilles tendon in a sport which requires pretty explosive jump abilities. This is some other work we've just started to get into over the last kind of year or so, and that's again using this concept of loading the body with external weight. So it's a little less, I guess, a bit more technology driven than just putting a weighted vest on. This is using a product called Exogen to actually start to load limb segments. Whether you could just want to use the torso, you could do just load the quads, load the hamstrings, load the calves, in certain positions. And we're talking small weights, just 50 grams on the calf. You might change the configuration depending on what kind of response you want. And we've shown that the effects of wearing these garments on running gait. We've just published that this year, and shown that you can accommodate quite a lot of weight in the torso, but once you start to load the lower limbs, especially the closer you get to the ankles, then you really do start to change running kinematics, which may or not be desirable. But from a priming perspective, we've started to apply this to swimming as well. We've started to look at, similar to our running vest study, what happens when we kind of load the swimmer's arms prior to a time trial. And again, this is all kind of fairly new work. We don't really know what the optimal weight is to weight the limbs. Certainly in swimming, where it's going to be pretty critical, how athletes respond to this. But we kind of came up with a formula looking at the level of athlete, their performance times, what muscle, how big they were, to try and come up with a bit of a loading factor. So it's this is all a fairly exploratory work. But we certainly loaded their upper limbs with weight based on our kind of formula. And this is some of our provisional data. We haven't published it yet, and the study's not quite complete, but I'm happy to share with you what we've kind of found. And certainly when we look at the effects on their warm-up, so they did some kind of, type sprints to prime with and without the vest. And we can see here that with the intervention, the sprint times during the warm-up were slower. Okay, so wearing the garment actually slowed them down during those warm-up sprints. But when we look at the performance trial over 200 meters, these are the 50-meter splits. Certainly in the first 50, and not so much in the second 50, but this first half of the trial, we do see a performance enhancement, or a tendency for performance enhancement. So suggested that the PAPs worked, they're getting out of the blocks, they're swimming hard, they're beating their times. But it starts to kind of fall apart a little bit in the back 200. So we've got PAP in the potentiation effect in the first half, but not in the back half. So is there a pacing issue? What's going on? Is the removal of the garments giving them a false sense of invincibility during the trial? So certainly a bit more work to do there. But if it was a 100-meter trial, we would have seen a performance enhancement. So watch this space for some more kind of news in this area. But certainly we're looking at this in a number of sports. Another one we've been looking at recently is the occlusion. This has gained quite a lot of interest, and we've been doing some occlusion trials. Again, looking at some physiological responses and looking at time trial performance. What happens when you occlude the limbs? We've done some study looking at the effects of occlusion on the kinetic response, the VO2 kinetics, looking at oxygen utilization. Does it change it? And it seems to have an effect on the VO2 slow component. So this is the gradual rise in VO2 that is evident during heavy intensity exercise. We managed to reduce that, which is a good thing. And we also showed small performance enhancement as well. So potentially IPC acutely is a potential ergogenic effect. And there have been a nice paper came out this year by Cocking, who's done quite a bit of this work, looking at what IPC strategy is best, is more better. What happens when we change the number of cycles? So we did 5-minute periods of occlusion. What happens when you increase that from 4 5-minute cycles to 8-minute cycles? And I guess that to cut a long story short, the 4 by 5-minute approach seemed to be the most optimal for enhancements in performance. I talked about passive heating, just using a very passive way to do that. We can see here two kind of fairly well-known British athletes playing around with kind of their heated garments. And this is obviously the Winter Olympics, maintaining body heat after a warm-up. So there's lots of tools and tricks you can use just to kind of maintain that body heat and don't let it dissipate after a physical warm-up. But the message is don't get too hot. Okay, there's a tipping point between priming and maintaining that heat and the muscle getting over hot that where it starts to not function properly. And Bevan this year showed quite nicely that looking at sprint performance, and this is only in temperate environments, that you're in the heat condition, you're after 2 or 3 sprints, after some passive heating, your sprint performance started to get slower compared with heating and a cooling strategy. So yes, get hot, but don't get too hot. I've done a little bit of work with inspiratory muscle fatigue over the years, looking at inspiratory muscle training and fatigue, and inspiratory warm-up is another strategy which you can use to get your respiratory muscles primed. And there's been mixed studies in this area, mostly in team sports, but we can see this is time to exhaustion in an intermittent test. Some sprint power cycling didn't show anything, and then some badminton, like a badminton fitness type test, increase, but they all tend to reduce that sensation of breathlessness, and that might be important for some of your athletes who do rate perceived breathlessness higher than or out of the normal kind of range. So certainly it's a thing in kind of our toolbox in terms of looking at athletes who are predisposed to having some respiratory conditions. So what could an event day priming strategy look like? Well, you know, given all those factors that determine priming, I can't give you the kind of golden, this is what you must do. But certainly if you consider those factors, then you might kind of start with some AM priming if you can't do it in the afternoon. This is when you might start your generic warm-up anyway, prior to the event. If you haven't done AM priming, you might do some PM priming. You know, your use of music and inspiratory muscle warm-up might fit in there. You might use passive heat to maintain some of the effects of those warm-ups, especially if it's a cool, temperate environment or there's a long holding period. And again, using that to maintain all that good work you've tried to do. If you're New Zealander, you might slip a hacker in there just immediately before the event, or kind of make your own war dance up. And then you might do a half-time repriming strategy. So there are certainly, in that competition day, on event day, there are certainly a lot of things that you could do and what tools you could use to make sure that they arrive at start day in good performance. And this is just one of the studies that came out a few years ago now, how it's been done in an Olympic level athlete. And certainly the key message I get from here is athlete belief and acceptance were crucial to the adoption of that warm-up. Okay, so you've got to work with your athlete. You can't work in isolation with these things because, you know, ultimately they've got to believe that works. The power of belief is really strong. So just to finish, just some kind of top tips or take-home messages from my perspective and how I look at the world in terms of priming. Yes, consider the sport and athlete-specific factors. Decide from your toolbox what could be effective, practical, and accepted. You know, those are three key points there. And trial this multi-system approach. Use different ways to get your priming strategy across. Potentiation, you know, think of it both in terms of power as well as endurance. Certainly looking at the different ways of doing it. And think beyond just the muscle, you know, it's muscle and tendon. And consider this AM for PM. But I think it's fairly early days. There's only a few studies, you know, showing that effect. So it's certainly some more work needed there. And in terms of the metabolic priming, certainly effective across a range of intensities, those harder warm-ups, but make sure that recovery period is critical when you are doing a hard warm-up. Certainly 10 minutes plus is minimum. And again, this intensity recovery duration for our events. So thanks for your time.